Where I live in the US, especially in the South, specifically in Texas, there are many people who believe that Genesis is the oldest book in history, that it's the first book ever written, that it was written by Moses, and that it was composed between 1500 and 1250 years before our current calendar, none of which is true. First of all, historians have largely given up on Moses ever being a real person, and he still didn't write the Pentateuch, even if he was real. Scholars of biblical history say that Genesis was apparently written around the 5th century BCE and is thus 1,000 years younger than what fundamentalists want to believe. Then, since the discovery of Ashurbanipal's library in the mid-19th century, many Bible critics said that the fable of Noah's Ark was based on the Epic of Gilgamesh, which dates back to 2,100 years before calendar and 1,500 years before the version of the story that appears in the Bible. But that claim isn't entirely true either, because the Epic of Gilgamesh, despite all its fabled embellishment, is based on a kernel of truth. I've explained all this once before, but that was years ago, and that explanation was buried in a longer video that not that many people saw. So rather than repeat everything I said there, I'll just play the most important clip from that little bit that I wanted everyone to see.
Many myths are based on historical accounts, but they get embellished over time, becoming more and more mythical as the story is repeated over generations. This is exactly what we see with flood myths like Gilgamesh.
No, that's what we see in the Bible, where a historic event, a torrential storm of impressive severity, was exaggerated to impossible, mythical proportions, despite all evidence to the contrary.
They take the original historical account, the biblical flood, and grow it into a mythical, interesting story over time.
We don't have the original historical account. The closest we have is one vague reference to Ziusudra, son of Ubar-Tutu, in the Sumerian king list, which scholars say is about 1,800 years older than the story of Noah's Ark, yet still 500 years after the reported fact. Ubar-Tutu was the king of Shuruppak, which was evidently the site of the original flood. The Epic of Gilgamesh also places the flood in Shuruppak. And even though it changed Ziusudra's name to Utnapishtim, it still recognizes him as the son of Ubar-Tutu. It also mentions the name of Atrahasis, which is another name for the Noah character from another version of the same story to be written centuries later. Although the flood story in the Eridu Genesis keeps the name of Ziusudra as the main character, so we know which story they're talking about, and it's not Noah's Ark. The Sumerian king list says that 8 kings ruled over parts of Mesopotamia for a total of 385,200 years in succession. That's obviously impossible. Now, if you divide by 100, because each of these numbers end in a suspicious double zero, all of them, they're all rounded to a double zero, and how likely is that? Then divide by 12, adjusting for the lunar calendar, then we can see that these 8 kings more likely ruled for an average of 40 years each over a period of just 3 centuries. Importantly, after the flood, the very next king is not Ziusudra, but Jushur, who set the new capital in Kish. Jushur ruled for 1,200 years all by himself, which again, dividing by 100 and then dividing by 12 means he probably only ruled for 1 year, 12 months. Otherwise, we don't have any historic data on the flood of Shuruppak. All we know about that is what archaeologists can tell us, that the actual flood in question was a localized inundation of the Euphrates River in about 2900 BCE, showing that all these older versions of the story were much more accurate, pertaining to a torrential potential hurricane lasting about a week. And funny thing, the depth of that flood was determined to be 15 cubits, or 22 feet. This was what the archaeologists determined, 15 cubits, or 22 feet. Same as what the Bible says. But you know, storytellers like to embellish their tall tales, exaggerating sometimes until a couple thousand years later, when the Bible now says that just 22 feet of water somehow flooded the whole world.
For example, the earlier version of the Gilgamesh flood account clearly identifies the flood as a local river flood, with the dead bodies of humans filling the river like dragonflies, and moving to the edge of the boat like a raft, and moving to the riverbank like a raft.
That's not the Epic of Gilgamesh. That's the Epic of Atrahasis, another version of the same story. Actually, multiple versions in Assyrian and Babylonian, using the same name but with a couple differences in detail. Collectively, the different versions of the Epic of Atrahasis and the Epic of Gilgamesh Both say that the Noah character was instructed to build the ark out of whatever wood and materials he could obtain from dismantling his own house. Both versions also say that it should be about the size of a field, which is understood to be about 230 feet. And both versions say that the length of the vessel should be equal to its width. However, the Epic of Atrahasis clarifies that it should not be cubic nor rectangular, but circular, like the coracles that the Mesopotamians were already commonly using at that time. This shape is also confirmed by both Finkel's and Simmons' additional ark tablets. The scholarly opinion is that Ziusudra already had a coracle, which is like a rounded floating basket, which he could punt down the Euphrates, taking his livestock to market until the river flooded, washing him into the Persian Gulf. And that would be the truth of that story, what little there is.
Centuries later, this gets exaggerated into a global worldwide flood, where humans killed in the flood fill the sea like a spawn of fish.
Yes, the global dimensions of the flood is an exaggeration, but the bodies would not be like a spawn of fish, because that would imply that they're still alive.
Both accounts have a god or gods that are sending judgment, describe a worldwide inundation, have an ark built to specific dimensions that are loaded with surviving humans and animals, and land just a few hundred miles apart from each other after using birds as a test to find dry land.
Because, as should be obvious by now, all of these myths are based on the same event, in which Ziusudra survived a localized river flood resulting from a week-long torrent like a hurricane. Now look how much the earliest versions of the story have changed, even though this tale was literally carved in stone for the first 1,000 years or so. Then, when the Mesopotamian Empire fell, there were no more schools teaching how to read and write in cuneiform. So for the next 1,000 years, the ancestors of the biblical authors were illiterate, keeping the old stories alive as an oral tradition, where enhancements and embellishments were inevitable, causing the original relatively modest story to evolve into an exaggerated whopper of biblical proportions.